Okay, we now welcome back onto the show the editor of Spiked, one of my favourite websites in the entire world, Brendan O'Neill. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
It is going well. Well, actually, I want to just qualify that because I made a substantial bet that I mentioned on the show a few months ago that there would be a general election in the UK in October. Now, I am starting to think that's not going to happen. So before we get into Brexit, before we get into everything, is there a chance that there's going to be an election in the next 7 days?
Unfortunately not. And the reason why not is actually really deeply disturbing. It's because MPs keep blocking a general election. Boris Johnson has called for one twice. Officially in Parliament, he has said, let's have a general election, and MPs have voted against it. We're in a really weird position in the UK at the moment, where we have a political class that is plotting against the vote we made in the EU referendum in 2016 and simultaneously blocking a general election so that we can't pass judgment on them. So there won't be a general election in the next 7 days because Britain is teetering on the brink of being a banana republic.
I think that's for the best, Brendan. I don't think James needs his gambling encouraged. So it's going to help him personally, maybe not the UK. So why is today so important for Brexit?
I mean, every day is important in relation to Brexit right now. Boris Johnson got a deal, which everyone thought he wouldn't do. I'm deeply sceptical of the deal. I think it is very, very similar to Theresa May's. It's basically Theresa May's withdrawal agreement with a few tweaks here and there. And the problem with Theresa May / Boris Johnson's withdrawal agreement is that it pretty much keeps us under the jurisdiction of the European Union for a very long period of time. So it doesn't take back control, which was the slogan of the vote for Brexit in 2016, which 17.4 million people voted for. So I'm very sceptical of the deal, but I'm even more sceptical of the MPs who are refusing to vote the deal through, which is what happened on Saturday before recording this. On Saturday, MPs refused to vote the deal through. They kicked it into the long grass. They said, not interested, we can't have this, we need more time to read it. The deal keeps coming back to Parliament. They're going to potentially vote on it again at some other point. And the shorter version of the story is that the political establishment is doing everything within its power to prevent Brexit from happening. And that is irritating British voters to an alarming degree.
I remember when the Theresa May deal came out, the big pushback on it was basically that it still kept Britain in the customs market and it still made Britain subject to the laws of the European Union. Now, is that going to still be the case under the Boris Johnson agreement as well?
Yeah, Boris Johnson does something that in his agreement, he does something which he said he would never do, which is he agrees to the creation of a border between Britain and Northern Ireland. And he does that because he accepts the needs for Northern Ireland to be in different customs arrangements to the rest of the UK because it shares a land border with a part of the EU, i.e. the Republic of Ireland. So he said for months and months and months that he would never countenance breaking up the United Kingdom in this way by having a border down the middle of the Irish Sea. And now he's pretty much done that. And that's quite shocking. And for many of us, that's very disappointing. And there are many other things in his agreement which are problematic. For the transition period, the period through which the UK is very slowly leaving the European Union, during that transition period, we would still be beholden to European Union rules and European Court of Justice laws in relation to various areas of life about trade and goods and transporting goods and so on. The reason that's a problem, the reason that's a very serious problem, is because during this transition period, we will be moving to future negotiations in relation to our trade relationship with the EU. And if we are subject to the EU's rules in that transition period and can do nothing to change those rules, then it just means that the EU can really screw us over so that when it comes to negotiating future trade relationships, they will have the upper hand enormously. So Boris Johnson is setting us up for a bit of a problematic, soft Brexit. And a lot of people are waking up to that over the past couple of days and feeling a bit angry about it too.
Okay, so based on all that, what do you think is likely to happen, which is obviously a very difficult question, I understand, and what is best case scenario from your perspective that could happen from here?
The best case scenario for me is that we have a no-deal Brexit, because every deal that has been put forward is not really Brexit. It's a super soft version of Brexit. It's what we call Brino, Brexit in name only. And every deal that we've seen and every deal that's been put on the table would keep the UK in some fashion beholden to the EU's oversight. So I think the only real option is just to walk away, no deal, break off, and then try to strike up trade deals with other nations, try to patch up our relationship with the EU at some future point. But I think that's really the only option if we want to stay as a democratic country. That's the big question mark hanging over all of this. Does Britain want to be a democratic country or not? I know that sounds a bit melodramatic, but this is what is at stake at the moment, because we have a Brexit-supporting electorate. The largest number of voters in British history voted for Brexit, 17.4 million people. And we have a Remainer parliament, a Remainer business class, a Remainer civil service, basically a Remainer elite who are doing everything they can to prevent Brexit from happening. And that's the source of all the tension and all the crisis in the UK at the moment. So when you hear people say that Brexit is just too complicated, it's too difficult, we just can't get it through, we can't work out how to make it work, none of that is true. The tension derives entirely from the fact that the people want one thing and the political class want another thing. And right now, the political class has got the upper hand, and it's creating a serious sense of conflict in this country.
Why don't you unpack that, actually? So what is the actual conflict? Do you reckon it'll ever become physical, or is it just sort of a disassociation between working class and elites?
Well, when I interviewed Nigel Farage a few months ago, he said that the real choice facing Britain is between apathy and anarchy. Because if you get screwed over by the elites, and we all do at some level on a daily basis, but this is a kind of really a larger version of that. He said that the choice is really either to switch off and say, well, my vote doesn't count. Clearly my vote doesn't count, so I'll just stop voting and become apathetic, which I think is happening in some parts of the country. Or the response is to be a bit more anarchic and say, well, I'm going to take to the streets, I'm going to protest, I'm going to stir things up. We've had a mix of the two. I've been around the country quite a lot over the past 3 years. I've spoken to people in Brexit parts of the country, in Remainer parts of the country, and in the Brexit parts of the country, which, for the most part tend to be the more working class areas, the former industrial heartlands, particularly in the north of England, parts of Wales and so on. People are feeling either apathetic or very angry. So I've seen people saying, I'm never voting again, there's no point. And I've seen other people come onto the streets and take part in protests and marches and really, demanding that their vote is honoured. So the conflict at the moment, it's a political conflict. It's kind of bubbling under the surface. But I do think there will come a point when we have to ask ourselves, if 17.4 million votes can just be declared null and void, if the establishment can say those votes don't count, and therefore we're going to have another referendum, or we're just going to move on from Brexit entirely and not really have it. If that happens, then it's not a joke to say that Britain is no longer a democratic country and the right to vote no longer has any real meaning. So I do think we're on a really important precipice in relation to all of this. And I think the political establishment doesn't quite realise how destructive their behaviour is.
Well, just to touch on a couple of those themes, I read your speech that you made in Manchester over the weekend near the site where the Peterloo massacre took place. And in that speech, you spoke a lot about how it was a conflict between the working class and the elites and how it was about British democracy. Why don't you give us a little bit of a history lesson and tell us why the Peterloo massacre is so relevant to all this and what you see the link between that and Brexit to be?
Yeah, so the Peterloo Massacre is incredibly important in British history. It happened in August 1819, so this year was 200th anniversary. And it was 60,000 working people in Manchester who marched to a place called St. Peter's Field to demand the right to vote. And these were people who were living in exceptionally poor conditions and who wanted a voice in the political process. And they were attacked by the yeomanry. At least 15 people were killed with swords. Many, many others were injured. So it's a very notorious incident in British history. Very strikingly, even the Times newspaper, which at the time was like very seriously the newspaper of the establishment, even the Times came out a couple of days later and said, we've gone too far. So it was a turning point in relation to reform, and then we got the Great Reform Acts of the late 1800s and the early 1900s, which eventually gave people the right to vote. So it's very important. And what's interesting is that this year there was a film about Peterloo released by Mike Leigh. It's a very good film. And it was really striking because all the chattering classes who spent the past 3 years since the Brexit vote trying to block the votes of 17.5 million people, which includes 8 million women and includes millions of working class voters. Working class people were more likely than middle class people to vote for Brexit. They spent 3 years trying to block those votes, and then this film comes out and they all go to the cinema and they start crying in the aisles and they're saying how wonderful it is that these people rose up 200 years ago for the right to vote. So the level of hypocrisy and double standards has really been exposed by the fact that we've just been through the 200th anniversary of the Peterloo massacre. And I think what it really shows is that the thing that the people struggled for 200 years ago actually remains a quite controversial, contested idea, which is the idea that ordinary people should have a say in the political process. We know from the past 3 years that in the eyes of the political establishment, that is still a dangerous idea that they feel uncomfortable with. So the thing that's become clear to me and to many other people is that democracy is still an ongoing struggle, and all the democratic rights we thought had been settled, that's not quite as clear-cut as we thought it was.
Yeah, that's completely right. So I want to bring it back to the discussion happening this week. So as far as I can see, there's going to be 3 potential outcomes. Now, we've discussed no deal, and I think we're all agreed, like, if there's no deal, then that's clearly the most democratic option. That's what British people voted for 3 years ago. But the other 2 possibilities, as I see them, is either one, Boris Johnson's deal gets approved, and as you've said, Boris's deal isn't great and Britain might suffer long term from it, but at least it's a deal and there's sort of some end to the Brexit discussions. The other one being that there's another delay to Brexit. Now, will there be a delay, and like how humiliating is that for Boris Johnson? Because the whole thing of his prime ministership was always being like October 31st, that's the date it's going to get done. What happens if there is no October 31st for him?
Yeah, it's looking increasingly like there won't be a 31st of October. I mean, it's still vaguely possible, but because MPs passed a law a few weeks ago called the Benn Act, they passed this thing called the Benn Act, named after Hilary Benn, a Labour MP, who, by the way, is the son of Tony Benn, who was one of the great left-wing Eurosceptics of the 20th century. But Hilary Benn is a Remainer MP, and he passed a law which would force Boris Johnson to ask for an extension if he didn't have a deal agreed in Parliament on the 19th of October. So he didn't get his deal agreed in Parliament on the 19th of October, so he had to write a letter to the EU by law begging for a further delay, which he didn't want to do. And he wrote 2 letters, and I thought actually this was quite admirable. He wrote the letter that the law forced him to write, but he refused to sign it out of principle. He wouldn't put his signature on it because he thinks it's an abomination that the law has forced him to ask the EU for another extension, and I agree with him on that. And then he sent another letter alongside that letter saying, I'm asking for an extension, but I really don't want to, and I think it's completely wrong. So the thing is with all of this, even if there is an extension now, and it looks like the EU will eventually agree to one, maybe through till next February. The thing is that the more that Parliament screws over Boris, which is happening now on a daily basis, the more that his support goes up and up among the public. So opinion polls show him doing very well at the moment for a new prime minister, for a prime minister who came to power without a general election, which is what happened with Boris. All those factors taken into account, he's doing very well in opinion polls. And he does better every time Parliament screws him over. So every time there's a delay, Parliament forces him to delay or refuses to talk about his deal, or basically sucks up all the time of parliamentary business by insulting Boris and calling him an idiot and all this kind of stuff. His approval ratings go up with every one of those forms of behavior, which is really interesting because what it suggests is that people now feel that Parliament is a rotten institution, an illegitimate institution. In the words of Geoffrey Cox, our Attorney General, it is a dead Parliament. It shouldn't really sit anymore. It has no more democratic authority. And I think a lot of ordinary people share that view, and they are siding with Boris as a consequence of that. So if he does get an extension that he didn't want, I think it could work to his benefit because he could go to the public and say, I tried my best, guys, but that bloody establishment, that Remainer Parliament, those nasty people kept tying my hands and wouldn't let me do what you want me to do. So I think it could actually work to his advantage with the public.
Yeah, I think that's also so interesting because, I was listening to your interview with Rod Little for the Brendan O'Neill show, which was awesome. And one of the things you two were discussing was how there's increasingly a sense of, there's no point in voting. And if there ever does come to a point where there's another referendum, that maybe Remain does win just because the Brexit vote is so defeated. But then when you say stuff like, it's just increasing his poll numbers, is there any sense of growing anger in the British public that they'll even double down harder on leaving? Because I genuinely think if there was a no deal vote today, no deal would win so much more than any of the agreements that have been put up.
Yeah, I completely agree. But the problem we have at the moment, and this speaks to the seriousness of the democratic crisis in the UK, the problem that we have at the moment is that we are not allowed to vote for no deal. So if you look at the discussions they're having about a second referendum, everyone, the Remainer camp in politics, which is a very powerful camp, is constantly saying that no deal simply cannot be an option because it's too dangerous, it's too destructive, it would screw Britain up and all this kind of nonsense. Even though many opinion polls show that a majority of people think that if we can't get a good deal, we should walk away without a deal. So even though it has majoritarian democratic support, the establishment wants to take it off the ballot paper. The problem with a second referendum, things are so messed up at the moment and democracy is in such a dire state in this country that I would almost welcome a second referendum if it was just Remain versus Leave all over again, because then I would be on the streets with many, many other people saying, let's vote Leave and let's teach them a lesson and show them that we were serious. The problem is a second referendum, which is looking increasingly likely, would be a complete stitch-up. And it would be a choice between Boris's deal or something like Boris's deal and staying in the EU. So it would be a choice between soft Brexit and Remain. So the thing that we voted for in 2016, which was to stop being a member of the European Union, will have been taken off the ballot paper. It will no longer be a choice for the people. It will no longer be a choice that we are allowed to make. So if that comes about, and it may well come about, there's the question of whether it should be boycotted, how we should deal with it. And there's also the question of why this referendum should have any legitimacy in politics at all. Because let's not forget that if they cancel the first referendum, the one from 2016, the legitimate one, then that will be the first time in British history that a public vote was simply cancelled. It wasn't acted upon, it wasn't forced into law, it didn't take any force at all in the political sphere. It was simply declared null and void. That will be the first time in the history of British democracy, really 100 years or so, that has happened. And I think the establishment hasn't thought through the consequences of cancelling a public vote and what that will do to democracy in the UK and to the UK's reputation around the world.
Brendan, I wish we'd wrapped up this interview on some other emotion than intense sadness of the future of Britain. But anyway, Brendan O'Neill, editor of Spiked. If you are not checking Spiked every single day, at this point, there is actually something wrong with you. It is one of the best websites in the world. Brendan O'Neill, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Cheers. Thanks, lads.